Hi there, Cat Camp 2020. I am Dr. Dani McVety. I'm so honored to be here with you guys. Thank you so much for having me. In 2009, I founded a company that was brand new to the veterinary world at the time, Lap of Love Veterinary Hospice. It was just me. I was practicing emergency medicine at the time, and I started tapping into some volunteer work I had done when I was in college for human hospice. And particularly when you're in emergency medicine, there's a lot of times that we have to have conversations with family that go something like this. We're either going to need to, admit her into the hospital and do a lot of tests, and it's going to be 500 to a couple $1,000s maybe, or we need to start talking about euthanasia. And of course, the only wrong answer is going to be doing nothing at all. So there are a lot of times that we have to have those conversations with families in emergency medicine. And again, that's how I found myself really tapping back into the human hospice field. And I just kind of from a spur and really at the time just wanting to help make some extra money to pay back my student loans and more importantly, even do something that I loved. I started Labo Love Veterinary Hospice. What we do and what we've always done is strictly in-home end-of-life care for pets. At the beginning, I thought we would be doing a lot of hospice care, so maybe a lot of longer term in-home care to help pets be comfortable at the end. But I found that I can help other veterinarians do that part in the clinic. And a large part of what we do is in-home euthanasia. So along with that comes the conversation about how, what, when, where, why, and under what circumstances we're going to say goodbye to a beloved pet. So that's what this talk is going to be about, which is what we can do at the end, what we can't do at the end. And then at the end, of course, how we're going to make that as beautiful and loving and compassionate of an experience that we possibly can. Because I truly, truly, truly believe that when we have a peaceful and loving and compassionate end of life experience, perhaps that's euthanasia for most pets, that we heal better and that we open our hearts and homes to more animals more quickly. Which honestly, you guys are the ones, attending a cat camp like this, you guys are the ones that should be owning pets and should be loving them and having them in your home. And in that really weird kind of small way, we can, I hope, change the world. So let me talk about hospice first. Veterinary hospice is, of course, very different than human hospice. There are things that we can do and things that we can't do. Human hospice plays a much larger role in the end of life of humans, simply because we don't have the euthanasia available in most states under the same circumstances that we do in veterinary medicine. That's beyond the scope of this talk. But veterinary hospice really has a lot to do with you as the pet parent, what you're going to communicate to your regular veterinarian and what you want. And I'm going to be very clear with you guys at the beginning. There are some veterinarians that are very, very comfortable with this stage, and some veterinarians that just simply aren't as good at it. For example, I'm just not good at dermatology. I live in Florida. I should be because we have allergies all the time with our pets out here. But I'm just not, it's not something that has ever really interested me, even in vet school. So I have a hard time learning more about it and keeping up with it and that kind of thing. So if your veterinarian maybe isn't as comfortable with the hospice time, and ask them, they'll hopefully tell you, honestly what they think. But if they're not as comfortable with that hospice time, then maybe ask for a referral. There are, again, more and more of us veterinarians out there in different areas that are doing this. Lap of Love, we have over 150 doctors in 35 different states. So there are some of us, that do this on a daily basis. There are also tele-advice companies like ours that will have conversations with you over the phone that can also guide you on how then to go back to your regular veterinarian and how to request certain medications. In hospice care, just as in veterinary hospice, just as in human hospice, we really kind of push the line on some of these medications because we're not worried about them injuring the kidneys or the liver or anything like that anymore. We are strictly about comfort. So even in theory, if the medication that we're increasing the dose on might, in theory, shorten the lifespan of your pet, that's a risk that we're willing to run because of the fact that we have euthanasia, and most of the time we're going to be making that call before we really get to that end stage of that disease. That's the goal, because these end stages of many of these diseases aren't really very pretty or easy to watch. So definitely look and research and ask your veterinarian But there are a lot of pain medicine that we can use. A lot of our dogs get put on gabapentin, which is just one example. Trazodone is another one that we've been utilizing a lot lately. There's another medication called tramadol that many of you that you have older pets might be using. And it's a wonderful medication. And I was taught in vet school 15 years ago that it was a great pain medicine. But now some data is coming out that says that it's not as good of a pain medicine. That's why I'm mentioning it to you now. But what tramadol does do is it does calm the pet down. So when we have pets, particularly large dogs that are panting, pacing, whining, crying at nighttime, or even cats that can't get comfortable, and maybe you just know they're not acting like themselves, sometimes it's a medication that we may use just simply to make them feel better. Cats, we use a lot of times a medication called buprenorphine, which is of course an opiate. And it's a fantastic medication. The other reason why we love it so much for cats is because we can just kind of squirt it in the mouth and it's absorbed in the gums. So we have a lot of options, a lot of ways that we can get medication into your pet that your veterinarian may not be completely up to date on. So if your veterinarian is not, then definitely reach out. And I want you guys to make sure that you have that knowledge and that right to reach out and find somebody that does this specifically. We can't say specialized yet because there's no board certification for veterinary hospice yet. There might be one in a couple decades. It takes that long to get it going. But we can certainly say that this is what our practice is limited to, and this is the only thing that we do. So besides that, I'm going to talk about a couple of other things. We have a very short amount of time. I wish I could talk to you guys for an hour. But the one other thing I want to talk to you about before we go into what we call the 4 budgets, which is going to help with the quality of life conversation, is this idea of a natural passing. So a lot of times pet parents will say to me, well, I just want my cat to pass naturally. And that's certainly understandable. I definitely want to maybe readjust our scope of what natural is. Natural passing, remember, is out in the wild and typically around 5 or 6 or 7 years of age. A cat will be get a disease. Of course, a car is not a natural predator, but perhaps out in the Serengeti in Africa, they don't have those. But if a cat is outside right now, if we have a feral cat, they're only going to live to be about 5 to 8 years old. And being an emergency veterinarian, I would see these cats come in all the time, and it was heartbreaking because you have no idea how long they've been in a sufferable situation. Just mange that ends up literally killing them, fleas that can suck them dry of blood, getting hit by a car, and injuries that end up kind of healing, kind of not. So my point is that a natural passing is very different for us in the way that we live nowadays versus what Mother Nature intends a natural passing to be. Mother Nature is neither quick nor painless. We know this. The death process is not one that comes without pain. I remember when I first started Lap of Love, there was a very sweet woman who called me with her cat, and he had going on end stages of renal failure. And we had many conversations over the phone about what she wanted and what she didn't want. And I was a brand new veterinarian at this point. I was probably about 6 months out of school, still doing emergency work, and had just started Lap of Love at the same time. And I was coaching her, and she was very adamant that she wanted a quote natural passing. And I'll never forget where I was when she called me, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and she was screaming at me. She was so mad at me that I let her go through that process of a natural passing. She said that her cat was screaming, that he was grabbing onto a blanket, that his nails were digging into her skin because he was in so much pain, and that she finally had to take him to the emergency room. And that he was, obviously a very difficult euthanasia at that point. It's not what she wanted. And I remember feeling very, very, obviously very regretful at that time. I thought I was doing what she wanted. And so from then on, I've been very, very clear with people about what a natural passing actually looks like. And it's not go to sleep and not wake back up. That's not what a natural passing is. Maybe 1% of the time that happens, you just kind of come home and you find them passed away, but that's not something that's very typical at all. So if that's something that you're trying to lean on, I would definitely make sure that you know what you're in for, but also that you are completely prepared and knowledgeable, and that that you know your own boundaries. All right. So make sure that you ask your veterinarian, ask any of the medical guidance that you have with you, what that's going to look like. And I also want to make sure you guys understand that a natural passing for kidney failure looks very different than it does for congestive heart failure. Every disease process is going to guide us on how I'm going to tell you what that natural death process may or may not look like. So again, make sure you get that guidance from your doctor based on the disease process that your pet has. And again, I really want to stress it enough that a natural passing, when you're prepared for it, like human hospice is, when you're medicated, sometimes it can be a beautiful thing. But people that say to me, I just want him to go to sleep and not wake back up, I say that's what euthanasia does, is they go to sleep and they don't wake back up. Euthanasia, the actual medication, is an overdose of barbiturates. So we give it typically intravenous, although there's many different ways that we can give the medication. Intravenous just means in the vein. And so it gets circulated into the body. And then because it's a barbiturate, it affects the brain. So the brain goes to sleep. The respiratory center is all the way in the back of the brain, very protected back there. And once it becomes an overdose, then the respiratory center gets shut down. That's what an overdose is. And then tertiary to that, the heart will stop. So barbiturates, when we deliver that medication, the euthanasia medication, we're not stopping the heart as a function of the medicine. Stopping of the heart and the death is a side effect of an overdose of barbiturates. So it's a very, very peaceful way to go. I call it an epidural, for death. And death is something that's going to happen whether or not we step in. So remember that, the death process will happen whether or not we euthanize or not, just like the birthing process will happen whether or not we use an epidural or not. I have a lot of respect for the natural process of going in and out of this world. I'm pregnant with my fourth kid right now, and my first two were born at home naturally on purpose. My third was C-section because I had complications. But my point is that I have a lot of respect for the natural process. But when it comes to euthanasia and pets, I also have a lot of respect for the quality of death that we provide, because we can't talk to pets about why they don't get the decision to skip the suffering part of it like we do under some circumstances. So again, euthanasia is a very, very beautiful thing. I said a phrase a second ago that I want you guys to remember too. We talk a lot about quality of life, and I'm going to go through a couple of things here in a second that we'll discuss that a little bit more. Quality of life, quality of life. It's a very common statement that you're going to hear. At some point, particularly in hospice care, we start switching to what's called a quality of death. And the reason why we say that is because I want all the families that I work with and that our team works with to understand that we can provide a beautiful, beautiful passing. Death, of course, is not a pretty thing, just like birth is not a pretty thing. But we can do our very best to provide this beautiful quality of life. And if you have a pet, or I'm sure most of you have been through this at some point in your life, as your pet ages and we get kind of towards that end, we start to make decisions on a daily basis, whether or not it's going to be today or not today. Are we going to medicate? Are we going to go back to the veterinarian? What are we going to do? But I can tell you that based on your disease process that you have, again, renal failure is something that we can get a long time with. Congestive heart failure is not something that we can get a long time with. So if a renal failure family wants to really push the envelope and wait a long time, that's something that I can help them do under most circumstances. But a congestive heart, failure cat, we don't always have that time available, because that heart is going to work until the second that it stops, meaning it's going to go downhill very, very quickly. So under those circumstances, I will make sure that I'm very clear with the family that says, right now we have the possibility of providing you a beautiful quality of death. You can be at home surrounded by family, candles lit, prayers said. We can go to, I'm in Florida, so I apologize to all of you that are not. But we can go to the beach and have a beach ceremony. And, there's all these beautiful things we can do to honor your pet. But if we wait too long, that option will be taken away from you, and you will be driving to the emergency room at 2:00 in the morning. We used to provide round the clock care, but we don't anymore for many reasons. One of the most important reasons is that cops don't like it when I go through stop signs and red lights very fast. I got a couple tickets. So rushing to an appointment is no longer something that we can do. Over 50% of our families call us with less than 48 hours notice. So short notice is very, very, very common for anybody that does in-home end of life care. But emergency appointments are very different. The quickest and fastest way to get your pet out of suffering in those circumstances are for you to go directly to the emergency room, and that's our communication. But I don't want you to get that I don't want you to get to that point. We're not an emergency service. No one that does this work can do an emergency service. But I want all of my families to understand that the sooner that you make that decision under appropriate circumstances, the more we can guarantee a peaceful, calm, loving, compassionate, and in-home end of life experience. And that is what a quality of death is. That's what a quality of death is. Now you're probably asking, well, when, right? When do we make this decision? When I first started, I didn't know how to answer this question, right? Everybody is asking me this question. I just went through 10 years of schooling and I don't know how to answer that question. But let me give you over the past 12 years what I've learned and how we coach families through this. So there is not one moment in time when it's the appropriate time to say goodbye to your pet. Sometimes there's a moment when you can't wait any longer, and that typically happens at the emergency room when I'm saying we have to make this decision now because he's suffering. Now, but there's rarely one moment in time, but rather there's a subjective period of time when it's an appropriate decision to make. And before this, as a veterinarian, I'm going to refuse to euthanize because there's a quality of life, right? And these families typically don't come to us. This isn't you, all right? This is when a quality of life exists. But after this time is when there is sustained suffering, and I'm telling you, as a doctor, we have to say goodbye because there's sustained suffering, and the action of death has already begun. This is the dying process has already started. Now, theoretically, we're all dying at the moment, but you know what I mean. So in the middle is a subjective period of time in which euthanasia is an appropriate decision. Some families have family in town and they need to plan and they need to make sure that, that everything is set up properly because they want to, I don't know, witness a cremation or something like that. There's some things that families really, really want and that require planning. And sometimes those have to happen a little bit sooner. Sometimes families maybe have never been through this before and they're pushing the envelope and they really want to wait until that very, very last moment because they want every last moment with their pet. And when we push that envelope, like I said before, we really do risk going to the emergency room, right, in the middle of the night. Now, additionally to that, there are also some families that have pushed it in the past, and they push it so far that once they actually say goodbye to their pet, they get up after the euthanasia and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so," and I'll finish their sentence. I'll say, "You relieved?" And they say, "Yeah, I'm so relieved." And like, but then they're like, "I feel guilty for being relieved." I'm like, no, you don't. There's always going to be a little bit of guilt associated with the loss of a pet, whether or not it's euthanasia or death. But when sometimes when we push it a little bit further, we become extremely relieved that they're not in suffering anymore and that we don't have to worry about them anymore. So I don't want you guys to be scared of that emotion when you do say goodbye, but just be aware of it. Now, I will also tell you that a very interesting phenomenon started to happen that I saw a couple years into doing this work, which is that families that have pushed the line in the past, sometimes when they're going through this with a subsequent pet, will actually want to say goodbye very, very much more sooner in the continuum of care. Some of these families have done very drastic measurements, oncology and radiation, and have been going, taking their pet to the veterinarian once a week for 2 years or whatever it may be. A lot of these families have been spent a lot of money, a great deal of money, thousands and thousands of dollars, just getting to that very, very last edge. In fact, I had a family had a golden retriever and 6 years old that had osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer. Very, very sad. Goldens get this kind of frequently. And we waited to the very end, and that's what they wanted. And they did an amazing job. And I mean, they did everything that I told them to do. It was perfect. And they did, of course, get, to the very, very end. The problem is that about a year later, they actually called me with their second pet, and their second pet was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. And literally, they called me on the way home from the veterinarian, and they said, "Can you come to our home today and help us say goodbye?" And it was very sad, But they told me, they said, "We just don't want to go through what we went through last time. We don't want to put her through what we put Toby through last time." And that's a very, very, very valid concern. This end of life experience for people carries a lot of emotion, and not just for the family going through it, and not just for the pet as well, but also sometimes there's other things happening in your family. We have people that have spouses that are getting sick. And with COVID these days, there's a lot of stress in the environment. And sometimes walking through that path is very, very stressful for people. And not always do you really get a good quality of life or a good quality of time with your pet, even when you do push the edge. So it's definitely something to consider. So along those lines, how do we know when to make that decision in this continuum of a subjective period of time? There are 4 budgets that we talk about with families very, very frequently. So the first budget is something that you guys are all going to understand, which is the financial budget, right? Money. Everybody understands what I can afford and what I can't afford when it comes to money. There are a lot of studies out there and data that say most people really don't have more than a few $100s worth of just disposable income at any given time. And it's very difficult for us as veterinarians to ask somebody to spend money on a pet that we know is only going to make it maybe weeks or months. Some of you think that that's completely fine, and then you would do that and you would mortgage your house, to get your cat just another month. And there's nothing wrong with that by any means. I just never want to put a family in a situation of not being able to care for their human kids and not being able to put food on their table and not being able to make a mortgage payment just to get to a few more weeks with your pet. A lot of people feel very guilty about that, but I don't think that's something that our pets really want us to feel. I think our pets want the very best for us. They're very pure in spirit. They're pure in love and everything. And I just don't always think that that's the best thing to do, to really stress yourself out financially just to get a little bit more time. And also given the fact that time isn't always quality. Some of that time is spent in a hospital, going in the car, going back and forth between clinics and shoving medication in their mouth and that kind of thing. So that's the first one, is the monetary budget, understanding what you have and what you have at your disposal and what you don't have at your disposal as well. The second one is probably the most important one, which is your emotional budget. I have helped families say goodbye to pets that have been in really amazing circumstances, both sad and also just heartfelt circumstances. I have euthanized dogs and cats that belong to spouses that have died, that belong to children that have either committed suicide or have been killed somehow. I have helped, there was one particular woman that she was in an abusive relationship for many, many years. And her partner ended up turning on the animals. And at that point, I had to help her. We had to make some very tough decisions for the numerous animals that she had collected over the years. And she told me that she collected these animals to help ease the pain. So many, many, many different things. I actually started in 2009 as well, when the foreclosure market was just rampant. And there were so many people that I had to help that were being placed, or the homes had been foreclosed on and they had to go move in with someone else and they couldn't take their pet. And we had to make some tough decisions. And sometimes that's a shelter and sometimes that's saying goodbye. So my point is that the emotional budget is very different for everybody. Sometimes it's not just losing a cat anymore. Sometimes it's losing that spouse, it's losing that child again. It's going through the loss all over again. And sometimes that means that people want to wait for as long as they can. And sometimes that means that it's a suffering. They are suffering every time that they are having to think about this. So that emotional budget is really something that's very important for me as a veterinarian, as a hospice practitioner, to talk to families about and to help them decide what they are capable of undergoing and what they are not capable of undergoing. Sometimes, again, saying goodbye in a very peaceful, calm, and loving way is the very best way for a family to begin that healing process. And again, I'm saying within that subjective period of time, for the pet. So we talk about financial budget and emotional budget. And the next budget is the physical budget. There are some pets that require a great deal of nursing care. And maybe not necessarily for cats, but for large dogs, sometimes we're talking about turning them over and cleaning them and making sure that, they're able to kind of get up and walk around with assistance. And if you have a 120-pound Mastiff, and potentially maybe the owner doesn't have a good back and can't get them up and moving around, that's a very serious budget that we have to consider. Cats, of course, we don't have necessarily that same kind of budget. However, The physical budget with cats becomes, can you get your pet to give them the medication? I've had a couple families that the cat started running away from them, when they went to go give medication, whether it be oral medication or sometimes injectable medication or subcutaneous fluids, just meaning under the skin, or even diabetes medications. Sometimes it ends up happening that your cat's running away from you every time you walk up to it because they think you're going to shove something down their throat. And that's a valid concern, and that ends up a little bit harming the human animal bond. So it's something to take in consideration, that if your pet requires all these medications to get him to the end, and yet the bond between you and him is being stressed during that time, is that really the best for you and your beloved pet? And maybe it's time to say goodbye a little bit earlier. So that's budget, emotional, physical. The last budget that we're going to talk about is the time budget. This is something that is, different for everybody, obviously, but some families have the time to chase their pet around the house and to give them medication and to do every 6-hour medication administrations, and to keep their pet clean and that kind of thing. And some families sit there and tell me, they're like, look, I'm a single mom. I'm working 2 jobs, or, I am a dad that travels around, for work. And it's very difficult for me to get medication into my pet 3 and 4 and 5 times a day. And that's it's a very, very valid thing. And it's something that we need to discuss, as a team, and talk about what we can do and what we can't do. So again, the 4 budgets are monetary, emotional, physical, and time. And all those things are very, very, very valid concerns, for for a family to go through. And once when we're within that subjective period of time, it's going to take you having someone that you trust and guidance that you trust to help you and the practitioner that you're working with make the very, very, very best decision that you can possibly make. The one last thing I'll say is again something that I found after a few years of practicing, which is that families going through this for the very first time. So if you're facing the loss of pet for the very first time, you tend to wait to the very, very end. And sometimes that means you wait too long, which means you're in the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I don't say that as it's my opinion, but it's actually just something that I found and what families tell me. So, when you're going through this for the first time, again, you want to do the right thing, and every day you're making that, you want to make sure you're making that right decision. And sometimes, again, that means you end up waiting too long. I really want to give you guys permission to have that quality of death and to say goodbye at a time when it's a peaceful decision to make. Sometimes that means your pet even looks good on that day that you're saying goodbye. But something a friend told me a long time ago, it's better to help a friend a day too early than a second too late. And when I see people go through this experience where they've waited too long and their pet has actually suffered, they regret doing that more than anyone has ever regretted doing it too soon. I've never had somebody regret doing it too soon, not one. I have had numerous families regret waiting too long. So again, I want to give you guys permission to have those conversations. I also want to give you permission to find a practitioner that knows this type of work and is very good at this type of work. Please remember that veterinarians, we are trained to save lives. And that doesn't mean that we're always trained to help you through a decision at the end of life. And sometimes euthanasia can feel like a failure to us even. We want to save them. We want them to live as long as possible. And sometimes when we euthanize, it does feel like a failure. So I want you to give, I want you guys to have permission to ask those really tough questions, to really think about it with yourselves, to reach out and find a hospice practitioner that does this and that can give you a bit of guidance when you're facing that hard decision. So thank you so much for your time. Our website is lapoflove.com. If you have any questions, we have tons of videos and resources, even if we don't have a veterinarian in your area. Or if we're, if literally just come to us for resources, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So we have lots of articles on there and all that kind of stuff if you ever need anything. But again, I'm Dr. Dani McVety, founder of Lap of Love Veterinary Hospice, and I'm so happy to have had this time with you guys. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Bye-bye.